There are empires that thunder through history with such force that their names become immortal. Rome, Persia, China. But there are others, civilizations of equal grandeur, equal sophistication, equal power, whose stories have been buried beneath centuries of sand and silence. This is the story of the lost empires. The forgotten kingdoms that built pyramids before Rome had walls, that commanded armies when Europe was scattered tribes, that traded gold and ideas across continents while much of the world lived in isolation. Today, we begin in a place that ancient writers called the land of the gods, a kingdom that once conquered Egypt itself, a civilization so advanced, so wealthy, so powerful, that for nearly 1,000 years it stood as one of the greatest forces in the ancient world. This is the story of Kush. Close your eyes and imagine the Nile River in the year 750 BCE. Not the familiar Egypt of the pharaohs. Travel south, past the great temples of Luxor, beyond the rushing waters of the first cataract, into a realm that the Egyptians themselves called Ta-Seti, the land of the bow. Here, where the deserts of Nubia meet the fertile valleys of the Upper Nile, a civilization had been rising for over 2,000 years. The Kingdom of Kush, ancient even when Egypt was young, wealthy beyond measure, and deeply, intimately connected to one of history's most famous civilizations, sometimes as partner, sometimes as rival, and for one extraordinary century as its conqueror. The story begins around 2500 BCE, during what archaeologists call the Khmer period, named after the ancient city that would become Kush's first great capital. While the Egyptians were building their pyramids at Giza, the people of Khmer were establishing something equally remarkable, a sophisticated urban center with massive mud brick structures called deffufas, some rising over 60 feet high. These weren't primitive villages. Khmer was a planned city. Its massive western deffufa served as a temple complex, its walls thick enough to support multiple stories, its interior chambers decorated with glazed tiles that shimmered in the desert sun. Archaeological excavations have revealed workshops producing fine pottery with distinctive black-topped red ware, a ceramic style so refined that it required precise temperature control during firing. This was high technology for the Bronze Age. But Khmer's true wealth lay in its position. It sat at the intersection of trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Gold from mines in the Nubian desert, ebony and ivory from the African interior, incense and exotic animals. All of it flowed through Kush, and the kingdom's rulers grew rich beyond imagination. For centuries, Egypt and Kush existed in an uneasy relationship, trading partners one generation, bitter enemies the next. Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom period, around 2000 BCE, speak of military campaigns into Nubia, of fortresses built to control the gold trade, of pharaohs who boasted of subduing the wretched Kush. But here's what those pharaohs didn't write in their victory inscriptions. Kush was winning. By 1500 BCE, during Egypt's famous New Kingdom period, the age of Tutankhamun and Ramesses the Great, Kush had become so powerful that Egypt maintained a permanent viceroy in Nubia, a position called King's Son of Kush, one of the highest offices in the entire Egyptian state. Egyptian princes served there. Egyptian gold came from there. Egyptian military power, to a large degree, depended on Nubian archers, warriors so skilled with the bow that the Egyptians hired them as elite mercenaries. But empires rise and fall. By 1070 BCE, Egypt's new kingdom collapsed into chaos. Civil war, foreign invasion. The unified state shattered into competing dynasties. And in that moment of Egyptian weakness, something extraordinary happened. Kush became free. Around 800 BCE, a new capital emerged in the heart of Kush. Its name was Napata, built in the shadow of a sacred mountain called Jebel Barkal, a flat-topped peak that rose from the desert like a natural pyramid, its cliffs believed to be the dwelling place of the god Ammonius. Here, the rulers of Kush built temples that rivaled anything in Egypt. They adopted Egyptian religious practices but infused them with their own traditions. They carved their names in hieroglyphs but maintained their own language and customs. They were Kushites, proud, powerful, and about to change history. In 747 BCE, a Kushite king named Kashta decided that the chaos in Egypt had gone on long enough. The sacred land of the gods had fallen into disorder. The temples were neglected, the old traditions forgotten, and Kashta believed that he, a Nubian, a Kushite, a black African king, had been chosen by Ammonius to restore Egypt to its former glory. His son would finish what he started. Pi, king of Kush, pharaoh of Egypt, one of the greatest military commanders the ancient world had ever seen. In the year 728 BCE, Pi assembled an army and sailed north down the Nile. Not to conquer Egypt, to save it. At least, that's how he saw it. The so-called victory stela of Pi, a massive granite monument covered in hieroglyphs, tells the story in his own words. It's one of the most detailed military accounts from the ancient world, and it reveals a king who was as much a religious zealot as a warrior. Pi's campaign was methodical and devastating. City after city fell. At Hermopolis, the local rulers surrendered and brought tribute: silver, gold, lapis lazuli, horses, and precious stones. At Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, Pi laid siege to the city for months. When it finally fell, he entered the temples first, not to plunder them, but to purify them. He washed the statues of the gods. He made offerings. He restored the rituals that had been abandoned. This wasn't just conquest. It was religious restoration. By 715 BCE, Pi's brother Shabaka had consolidated Kushite control over all of Egypt, founding what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty. The Nubian dynasty, the Black Pharaohs. For nearly a century, Kushite kings ruled both Kush and Egypt as a unified empire, the largest territorial state in the Nile Valley's history. These weren't foreign occupiers imposing alien rule. They were devout believers in Egyptian tradition, perhaps more traditional than the Egyptians themselves. Pharaoh Taharqa, who ruled from 690 to 664 BCE, embodied this golden age. He built more temples and monuments than any pharaoh since Ramesses II, 6 centuries earlier. His name appears on structures from the Nile Delta to the Third Cataract, at Karnak, at Memphis, at Jebel Barkal. The Greek historian Strabo, writing centuries later, called him the greatest of the Ethiopian kings. Archaeological evidence reveals an empire at its height. Taharqa's palace at Memphis was decorated with glazed tiles depicting bound enemies from across the known world. His treasury overflowed with tribute from vassals and trade partners. His armies included not just Nubian archers, but Greek mercenaries, Libyan cavalry, and Egyptian infantry. A professional, multi-ethnic force that made the 25th dynasty one of the great military powers of the age. But Taharqa faced a threat that no pharaoh before him had ever confronted. A new empire, rising in the east, with an ambition to conquer the entire known world. Assyria at the 670s BCE, the Assyrian Empire had become the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. Iron weapons, professional soldiers, siege engines that could breach any wall. From their capital at Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq, the Assyrian kings had conquered Babylon, Syria, the Levant, and now they set their sights on Egypt. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt with a massive army. Ancient texts describe a brutal campaign. Taharqa's forces met them in battle in the eastern Nile Delta. For a time, the Kushites held, but the Assyrians were relentless. They pushed south, capturing Memphis and forcing Taharqa to retreat to Thebes. Esarhaddon declared himself pharaoh. He had defeated the Black Pharaohs. But Taharqa didn't surrender. He regrouped. 2 years later, after Esarhaddon died on a campaign, Taharqa struck back and retook Memphis. The Assyrians returned in force under Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, one of history's most formidable warrior-kings. In 664 BCE, Ashurbanipal's army sacked Thebes. The ancient capital, home to the greatest temples in Egypt, was plundered. Its treasures carted off to Assyria. The Greek poet Homer, writing a generation later, would speak of hundred-gated Thebes with awe, even in ruin. Taharqa fled south to Napata. He would never see Egypt again. His nephew Tanemani made one last desperate attempt to reclaim the north, but it failed. By 656 BCE, the 25th dynasty's rule over Egypt was over. But Kush itself? Kush endured. What happened next is one of the great untold stories of the ancient world. The Kushite kings withdrew to their heartland in Nubia, abandoning Egypt to the Assyrians and, later, to native Egyptian dynasties. But this wasn't the end. It was a transformation. Around 590 BCE, King Espelta moved the capital south from Napata to a new city, Meroe. Located between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, Meroe was more defensible, further from foreign threats, and positioned at the heart of rich agricultural land and iron ore deposits. This move marked the beginning of what historians call the Meroitic period, a civilization that would last another 1,000 years, long after the Assyrians had fallen, long after the Persians had conquered Egypt, long after Alexander the Great had marched to India and back. Meroe became an industrial powerhouse. Archaeological surveys have identified massive slag heaps, evidence of large-scale iron smelting. The Kushites became expert metallurgists, producing iron tools and weapons that were traded across Africa and the Mediterranean. Some scholars have called Meroe the Birmingham of ancient Africa, but it was also a cultural center. The kings and queens of Meroe built their own pyramids, not copies of Egyptian monuments, but distinctly Kushite structures, steep-sided, smaller, but numerous. Over 200 royal pyramids still stand in the deserts of Sudan, in the royal cemeteries of Meroe, Nuri, and El Karu, and they developed their own writing system. Around 300 BCE, the Meroitic script appeared, a unique alphabet distinct from Egyptian hieroglyphs, written both in hieroglyphic and cursive forms. To this day, scholars can read the letters, but the language itself remains only partially deciphered. The voices of Kush still whisper to us across the centuries, their full story waiting to be understood. The Kingdom of Kush would survive until the 4th century CE, when it finally fell to the rising Kingdom of Aksum. For over 3,000 years, this civilization had endured, longer than Rome, longer than the Persian Empire, as long as ancient Egypt itself. Yet today, how many people know its name? How many history books teach that Black African kings once ruled Egypt? That Nubian pyramids outnumber those in Egypt? That the technology, the trade networks, the military might of Kush shaped the ancient world? This is the first of many forgotten stories. Empires that built, conquered, created, and then vanished from memory, not because they weren't important, but because history is written by those who survived to tell it. Kush didn't survive, but its legacy is carved in stone, buried in sand, waiting in the ruins of temples and palaces for those willing to look. The lost empires of Africa and Asia aren't truly lost. They're just waiting to be found. In the year 356 CE, a Roman ship sailed south along the Red Sea coast, bound for the markets of India. Aboard was a Christian philosopher named Meropius and 2 young Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Adesius. They were traveling to expand their knowledge, to see the wonders of the ancient world, to perhaps make their fortunes in the spice trade. They never made it to India. At a small port on the African coast, local tribesmen attacked. Meropius was killed. The crew was slaughtered. Only the 2 brothers survived, spared because of their youth. They were taken as slaves to the court of the king of Aksum, a kingdom that most Romans had barely heard of, in a land they called Ethiopia. Those 2 enslaved boys would change the course of history. Within a generation, they would convert an entire empire to Christianity. They would establish one of the world's oldest continuous Christian traditions. And they would help transform Aksum from a wealthy trading kingdom into one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world. The Roman historian Mani, writing in the 3rd century, listed the world's 4 greatest kingdoms: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. This is the story of that 4th power. The African empire you've never heard of. The Aksumite Empire emerged in the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea sometime around the 1st century CE. But its roots went deeper, much deeper. The region had been connected to the ancient world for centuries through the port of Adulis on the Red Sea coast. Greek merchants had been sailing here since the time of the Ptolemies. The anonymous Greek text known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written around 50 CE, describes Adulis as a thriving port exporting ivory, rhinoceros horn, obsidian, tortoise shell, and enslaved people in exchange for Roman glassware, copper, iron, wine, and olive oil. But Adulis was just the gateway. The real power lay inland, high in the Ethiopian highlands, at a city called Aksum. Aksum sat nearly 7,000 feet above sea level, in a fertile plateau blessed with reliable rainfall, a rarity in this part of Africa. Here, The Aksumites developed advanced agriculture, using terracing and irrigation to grow wheat, barley, and teff, the grain that would become the foundation of Ethiopian cuisine. They domesticated cattle, mined gold, and controlled the trade routes that connected the African interior to the Red Sea and beyond. By the 2nd century CE, Aksum was minting its own coins, gold, silver, and bronze currency bearing the names and faces of its kings, inscribed in Greek, and later in Gizi, the ancient language that would evolve into modern Ethiopian languages. This was extraordinary. In the ancient world, only major powers minted their own currency. It was a statement of sovereignty, of economic might, of participation in the global economy. And Aksum's coins have been found everywhere, in southern Arabia, in India, in Roman Egypt. This was an empire that traded with the world. The 3rd century saw Aksum explode onto the world stage under a series of ambitious warrior kings. Around 200 CE, King Gadarat expanded Aksumite control across the Red Sea into southern Arabia, the region the Aksumites called Saba, and we know as Yemen. But it was King Izana, ruling in the early 4th century, who would make Aksum legendary. Izana inherited a powerful kingdom. His father had built a strong military, a prosperous economy, and diplomatic relations with Rome and Persia. But Izana would surpass them all. His reign, from approximately 320 to 360 CE, marked the height of Aksumite power. The evidence of his conquests is written in stone, literally. Izana erected massive granite stelae inscribed with his victories in 3 languages, Gizi, Sabaean, and Greek. These weren't mere propaganda. They were detailed military reports, listing kingdoms conquered, prisoners taken, cattle seized. One inscription describes his campaign against the Kingdom of Kush, the same Kush that had once ruled Egypt. By the 4th century, Kush was in decline, but it was still a significant power. Izana's army marched south along the Nile, sacking the Kushite capital of Meroe and bringing an end to a civilization that had endured for 3,000 years. "I burnt their towns," the inscription reads, "both those built of bricks and those built of reeds. My people seized their grain, their bronze, their iron, and the dried meat of their stores, and they cast them into the Nile." It was the end of one empire and the triumph of another. But Izana's most significant conquest wasn't military. It was spiritual. Remember those 2 Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Adesius, who had been enslaved after their ship was attacked. They had been brought to the royal court, where their intelligence and education impressed the king. They became tutors to the royal children, including the young prince who would become Izana. Frumentius and Adesius were Christians. And slowly, carefully, they began to introduce Christian ideas to the royal court. They established a small community of Christian merchants in Aksum. They built a modest chapel. When the old king died and Izana took the throne, Frumentius became one of his most trusted advisors, around 330 CE, roughly the same time that the Roman Emperor Constantine was converting the Roman Empire to Christianity. King Izana converted to Christianity. The timing wasn't coincidental. Christianity was becoming the religion of the Roman world, Aksum's most important trading partner. But the conversion was also genuine. Izana's later inscriptions abandon references to the old gods and invoke the Lord of Heaven and the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Frumentius was sent to Alexandria to be consecrated as the first bishop of Aksum by Athanasius, the powerful patriarch of Alexandria. He returned to Aksum with the title Abuna, our father, and began the systematic conversion of the empire. This was a pivotal moment in world history. Aksum became the 2nd kingdom in the world, after Armenia, to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion, decades before Rome would do the same. And unlike in Europe, where Christianity often spread by conquest, in Aksum it was embraced by the monarchy and gradually adopted by the people. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, traces its roots directly to this moment. To Frumentius, the shipwrecked slave who became a saint. To Izana, the warrior king who built churches instead of temples. For the next 2 centuries, Aksum flourished. Its capital became one of the great cities of the ancient world, a place of monumental architecture, sophisticated engineering, and international prestige. the Aksumites were master builders. They quarried massive granite obelisks, stelae, some reaching over 100 feet in height and weighing hundreds of tons. These weren't crude monuments. They were intricately carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors, false windows, and elaborate decorative elements. The largest standing stela in Aksum today, the obelisk of Aksum, weighs 170 tons and stands 79 feet high. It's a single piece of carved granite, a feat of engineering that rivals anything in Rome or Egypt. How did they move these massive stones? How did they erect them without modern machinery? We still don't fully know. The largest stela ever attempted, now broken and lying on the ground, would have stood 108 feet tall and weighed over 500 tons. It collapsed during erection, perhaps because the Aksumites pushed the boundaries of what was possible too far. But Aksum's true glory wasn't in stone. It was in its cosmopolitan culture. This was a place where Greek-speaking merchants from Alexandria met Arab traders from Yemen, where Persian diplomats negotiated with African kings, where Indian spices mingled with African frankincense in the markets. The city's elite spoke multiple languages. Inscriptions in Guizi, Greek, and Sabaean show a multilingual, multicultural empire. Archaeological excavations have uncovered Roman glassware, Indian beads, Persian pottery, and Chinese silk, evidence of trade networks that spanned 3 continents. And at the center of it all was the royal palace complex, a sprawling series of buildings, courtyards, and gardens. Italian archaeologists excavating at Aksum have uncovered elaborate stone-built palaces with sophisticated drainage systems, multi-story structures, and even evidence of flush toilets, a level of urban planning that wouldn't be seen in medieval Europe for another 1,000 years. But there's another story here, one that complicates the narrative of Christian Aksum. Because Ethiopia is also home to one of the world's oldest Jewish communities, the Beta Israel, also known as Ethiopian Jews, their origins are shrouded in mystery and legend. Some Ethiopian traditions claim they descend from the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, whose kingdom, some scholars believe, may have been in southern Arabia or even in Ethiopia itself. Others suggest they were converts from the time before Christianity reached Aksum, or even refugees from Roman persecution in the Middle East. What we know is that for centuries, a distinct Jewish community existed in the Ethiopian highlands, practicing their own form of Judaism, one that developed in isolation from Rabbinic Judaism, preserving ancient practices that disappeared elsewhere. This tells us something important about Aksum. It was never monolithic. Despite the royal adoption of Christianity, the empire contained multitudes, Christians, Jews, adherents of traditional religions, immigrants from across the ancient world. This diversity was a source of strength, fueling trade, innovation, and cultural exchange. In the early 6th century, Aksum faced its greatest challenge and achieved its most controversial victory. Across the Red Sea, in the Kingdom of Himyar, modern-day Yemen, a crisis was unfolding. Around 523 CE, the Himyarite king, Yusuf Asar Yathar, known to later Christian sources as Dichu Nuwas, converted to Judaism. In a region that had long been a religious melting pot, with Christians, Jews, and polytheists coexisting uneasily, Dichu Nuwas began persecuting Christians. The details are contested and probably exaggerated by later Christian chroniclers, but multiple sources describe a massacre of Christians in the city of Nadran. The Christian community in Himyar appealed to Aksum for help. The Aksumite king at this time was Caleb, one of the most powerful rulers in the empire's history. The persecution of Christians in Arabia wasn't just a religious issue, it was a threat to Aksumite interests. Himyar controlled crucial trade routes and ports on the Arabian side of the Red Sea. Aksum couldn't afford to let a hostile power dominate the region. In 525 CE, Caleb assembled a massive fleet and army. Ancient sources speak of 60,000 soldiers, though this is likely an exaggeration. What's certain is that the invasion force was formidable. They crossed the Red Sea, landed on the Arabian coast, and marched inland. The war was brutal. Dhu Nuwas resisted fiercely, but Aksumite military might prevailed. According to legend, when defeat became inevitable, Dhu Nuwas rode his horse into the sea and drowned rather than surrender. Caleb installed a Christian vassal to rule Himyar, establishing Aksumite hegemony over southern Arabia. For a brief period, Aksum controlled both sides of the Red Sea, the most strategically valuable waterway in the ancient world, but empires that expand too far often find themselves overextended. Aksum's control of Himyar lasted less than a century. By 570 CE, the Sassanid Persian Empire invaded southern Arabia and pushed the Aksumites out. And then came a change that would transform the entire region, the rise of Islam. In 610 CE, the Prophet Muhammad began receiving revelations in Mecca, just across the Red Sea from Aksum's territories. As Islam spread across Arabia with extraordinary speed, Aksum found itself cut off from its traditional allies and trading partners. But here's a remarkable detail that most people don't know. The first Muslims to flee persecution in Mecca found refuge in Aksum, that in 615 CE. When Muhammad's followers faced violent persecution from the polytheist elite of Mecca, the Prophet told them to seek asylum in Aksum. "There is a king there," Muhammad reportedly said, "under whom no one is persecuted." A group of Muslim refugees, including the Prophet's daughter Ruqayya, crossed the Red Sea and appeared before the Aksumite king, possibly Caleb's successor. When the Meccans sent envoys demanding their return, the king refused. He granted the Muslims asylum and protection. This act of tolerance is remembered in Islamic tradition. It's why, according to some scholars, when Muslim armies later conquered surrounding regions, they left Aksum alone. The kingdom that had protected Muslims when they were vulnerable would not be attacked, but isolation came at a cost. As Islam spread across North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually the Horn of Africa, Aksum became increasingly cut off from the Mediterranean world. Trade routes shifted. The port of Adulis declined. The economy that had sustained the empire's grandeur began to contract. By the 8th century, Aksum was a shadow of its former self. The exact causes of the decline remain debated. Climate change may have played a role. Evidence suggests that rainfall patterns shifted, making agriculture more difficult. Political fragmentation weakened central authority. The loss of maritime trade devastated the economy. There were also invasions. Queen Gudit, sometimes called Yodit, a mysterious figure whose religious identity is disputed. Some sources say she was Jewish, others that she was pagan, led a revolt that destroyed much of Aksum's infrastructure around 960 CE. Churches were burned. Stelae were toppled. The royal dynasty was overthrown by the 10th century. The capital had moved south to the Zagwe dynasty's territory in the Lasta region. Aksum the city survived, but Aksum the empire was gone. Yet its legacy endured. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, established under Ezana, survived and flourished. Today, it's one of the largest and oldest Christian churches in the world, with its own unique traditions, its own ancient liturgy in Guizi, its own sacred texts. The Aksumites' architectural innovations influenced Ethiopian church building for centuries. In the 12th century, King Lalibela commissioned 11 extraordinary churches carved entirely out of solid rock, each church hewn downward from living stone, creating buildings that are both above and below ground. These churches, still used for worship today, are direct descendants of Aksumite architectural genius and the legend of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. The story that the Ethiopian royal dynasty descended from their union became central to Ethiopian identity. The Solomonic dynasty, which claimed this lineage, ruled Ethiopia until 1974, making it one of the longest continuous monarchies in human history. But perhaps Aksum's greatest legacy is simply this. It proved that African civilizations could stand as equals to Rome, to Persia, to any empire in the ancient world. That they could mint coins, build monuments, convert kingdoms, command armies, and shape history. For too long, the narrative of world history has marginalized Africa, treating it as peripheral to the main story of civilization. Aksum is proof that this narrative is false. Today, if you visit Aksum in northern Ethiopia, you can walk among the ruins of palaces, touch the ancient stelae, and visit churches that have stood for over 1,000 years. You can see the Ark of the Covenant Chapel, where, according to Ethiopian tradition, the biblical Ark of the Covenant is kept, brought to Ethiopia by Menelik I, the son of Solomon and Sheba. You can't see the Ark itself. No one can. Only one guardian monk, chosen for life, is permitted to enter the inner sanctum. Is it really there? Probably not. But that's not really the point. The point is that Ethiopia has maintained an unbroken connection to its ancient past, to Aksum, to Izana, to Firmentius, to the moment when an African kingdom embraced Christianity and became one of the great powers of the world. That connection has survived invasions, colonization attempts, internal strife, and modernization. Ethiopia was never colonized by European powers, except for a brief Italian occupation from 1936 to 1941. It stands as a symbol of African sovereignty and continuity. The Aksumite Empire didn't disappear. It transformed, adapted, and endured in ways that few ancient civilizations have. And that's a story worth remembering. In 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot was traveling through the jungles of Cambodia, collecting butterflies and documenting plant species for European scientific journals. His local guides led him through dense forest, hacking through vines and undergrowth, until suddenly the jungle opened up. Before him rose towers of stone so massive, so intricately carved, so impossibly grand, that he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Temple spires jutted through the canopy like mountain peaks. Galleries stretched for hundreds of feet, their walls covered in elaborate bas-reliefs depicting battles, dances, and gods. Moats wider than rivers surrounded courtyards larger than European city squares. One of these temples, Mouhot wrote in his journal, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. He had stumbled upon Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever built. The crown jewel of a civilization that most Europeans didn't even know had existed. An empire that, at its height in the 12th century, controlled an area larger than the Byzantine Empire, commanded a population of millions, and engineered hydraulic systems so sophisticated that modern experts are still trying to understand how they worked. This is the story of the Khmer Empire, the civilization that turned water into power, stone into art, and a swampy floodplain into the greatest city on earth. Welcome to Angkor. Southeast Asia is defined by two seasons, wet and dry. For 6 months, monsoon rains transform the landscape into a water world. Rivers overflow. Lakes expand to many times their normal size. Rice paddies become inland seas. And then, as quickly as it arrived, the water vanishes. For 6 months, the land bakes under a merciless sun. Rivers shrink. Lakes recede. Drought threatens. Civilization in this environment required mastery of water, how to capture it, store it, distribute it, and control it. The people who could solve this problem would hold the key to prosperity, power, and empire. The Khmer people emerged in the lower Mekong River basin, in what is now Cambodia, southern Vietnam, and parts of Thailand and Laos. For centuries before the empire, various kingdoms rose and fell in the region, Funan, Chenla, and others whose names survive only in fragmentary Chinese records. These early kingdoms were sophisticated. Chinese envoys visiting Funan in the 3rd century CE described walled cities, ocean-going ships, and a writing system borrowed from India. Goods from the Roman Empire have been found in archaeological sites, evidence of long-distance maritime trade networks. But around 800 CE, something changed. A new kingdom emerged that would surpass everything that had come before in the year 802 CE. On a sacred mountain called Phnom Kulen, about 30 miles northeast of where Angkor would later rise, a king named Jayavarman II performed a ritual that would change history. Ancient inscriptions describe the ceremony as a Devaraja ritual, the establishment of the god-king cult. In the presence of Brahmin priests, Jayavarman II declared himself not merely a king, but a Chakravarti, a universal monarch, an incarnation of the god Shiva on earth. He proclaimed independence from the Javanese kingdoms to the south and established a new unified kingdom, the Khmer Empire. This wasn't just political theater. The concept of the Devaraja, the divine king, would become the ideological foundation of Khmer civilization. Each king was not just a ruler but a living god, and his primary duty was to build a temple mountain that would serve as his connection to the divine realm and, eventually, as his mausoleum. This belief would drive the Khmer to build some of the most extraordinary monuments in human history. But first, they needed to solve the water problem. Jayavarman II established his capital at Hariharalaya, near the modern town of Rayuos. His successors would move the capital several times over the next century, but each move brought them closer to the site that would become Angkor. Why this location? Because of a geographical peculiarity that the Khmer engineers understood and exploited with genius-level sophistication. North of Angkor lies the Kulin Hills. During the monsoon season, water rushes down from these hills, flooding the plain. To the south lies Tunnel Sap, the Great Lake, one of the most productive freshwater ecosystems on Earth. During the wet season, the Tunnel Sap River actually reverses direction, backing up from the Mekong and causing the lake to expand to 6 times its dry season size. The plain between the hills and the lake was perfect for rice cultivation, if you could control the water. The Khmer didn't just control it. They revolutionized it. Under King Indravarman I, who ruled from 877 to 889 CE, the Khmer began constructing massive artificial reservoirs called barays. The Indraditaka Baray, built by Indravarman, measured 2.5 miles long and 800 yards wide. It could hold billions of gallons of water. But the barays weren't just reservoirs. They were integrated into a complex hydraulic network that included canals, moats, channels, and embankments. Water from the hills was captured and stored in the barays during the wet season. During the dry season, it was slowly released through a sophisticated system of sluice gates and channels, irrigating rice fields and maintaining water levels in the moats that surrounded temples and cities. This system allowed the Khmer to grow multiple rice crops per year in a region where most civilizations could barely manage one. Archaeological evidence suggests that Angkor's agricultural system could support a population of up to 1 million people in the metropolitan area alone, making it one of the largest cities in the world during the medieval period, rivaling contemporary London or Paris. But here's the extraordinary part. We're only now, in the 21st century, beginning to fully understand how sophisticated this system was. In 889 CE, King Yasovarman I moved the capital to a new site he called Yesodharapura, the city we now know as Angkor. At its center, he built the Phnom Baking Temple Mountain, and surrounding it, he constructed the East Baray, a reservoir 7 miles long and 2 miles wide, the largest human-made body of water in the pre-industrial world. Over the next 3 centuries, Angkor grew into a sprawling urban complex covering nearly 400 square miles, larger than modern Los Angeles. But this wasn't a city in the Western sense. There were no city walls, no densely packed stone buildings. Instead, Angkor was a dispersed urban landscape. Temple complexes connected by roads, surrounded by neighborhoods of wooden houses built on stilts, interspersed with rice paddies, gardens, and ponds. The temples were built of stone, sandstone, and laterite, but everything else was wood and thatch, which is why so little of the residential city survives today. Only the temples endure, rising from the jungle like bones after the flesh has decayed. In 1113 CE, a king named Suryavarman II seized the throne, possibly through military conquest. His reign would mark the apex of Khmer power and produce the civilization's greatest monument. Suryavarman II was a warrior king. He expanded Khmer territory into what is now Thailand and Laos. He launched military campaigns against the Vietnamese kingdoms to the east and the Cham kingdoms along the coast. He sent embassies to China, seeking recognition as a major regional power. Chinese records describe the Khmer king traveling with a massive retinue, golden palanquins, accompanied by more than 100 golden parasols, carried by elephants, with soldiers and musicians beyond count. But Suryavarman's true ambition wasn't conquest. It was immortality through architecture. Around 1120 CE, he began construction on a temple that would surpass anything the Khmer, or anyone else, had ever built. A temple dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. A temple that would serve as both a state temple and, eventually, his mausoleum. A temple whose scale and artistry would make it the wonder of the medieval world. Angkor Wat. You approach from the west, crossing a massive moat, over 600 feet wide and nearly 3 miles in circumference. The water is so still it mirrors the temple like glass. A causeway of sandstone, perfectly aligned to the equinox sunrise, leads you toward the entrance. The outer wall rises before you, 24 feet high, nearly a mile on each side, enclosing an area of over 500 acres. You pass through the Gapura, The entrance pavilion, its doorway carved with dancing apsaras, celestial nymphs, each one unique among the thousands that decorate the temple, and then you see it. The temple proper. 5 towers rising in a quinkings pattern, 4 at the corners, 1 in the center, their lotus bud spires reaching toward heaven. The central tower stands 213 feet high, dominating the landscape for miles in every direction. But it's not just the size. It's the perfection. Every stone is precisely cut and fitted without mortar. The towers are perfectly proportioned according to complex mathematical ratios. The galleries, connecting the towers at multiple levels, are aligned with astronomical precision. And every surface, every wall, every column, every lintel is covered in intricate carvings. Jayavarman VII was already in his 60s when he seized power in 1181 CE, ancient by medieval standards. But he would rule for nearly 40 years and transform the empire. First, he drove out the Cham invaders and then led a counterattack, conquering Kampa and incorporating it into the Khmer Empire. At its greatest extent under Jayavarman VII, the empire stretched from modern Myanmar in the west to Vietnam in the east, from southern China to the Malay Peninsula, the largest territorial extent in Khmer history. But Jayavarman VII's true revolution was religious. While previous Khmer kings had been Hindu, Jayavarman VII was a devout Mahayana Buddhist, and he expressed his faith through an unprecedented building campaign. He constructed Ta Prohm, a massive monastery temple dedicated to his mother. He built Preah Khan, another enormous complex dedicated to his father. He established hospitals and rest houses along roads throughout the empire. Inscriptions describe 102 hospitals serving the population. And at the center of Angkor, he built a new state temple, Angkor Thom. Angkor Thom, the great city, was even larger than Angkor Wat. Surrounded by a moat and a wall nearly 8 miles in circumference, it could house a population of hundreds of thousands. At its center stood the Bayon, Jayavarman VII's state temple. And the Bayon is unlike anything else at Angkor, or anywhere else in the world. The 54 towers rise from the Bayon, and carved into each tower are massive stone faces, 216 faces in total, each one 8 feet tall. They gaze out in the 4 cardinal directions, serene smiles on their lips, eyes half closed in meditation. Who do the faces represent? The Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of compassion? The Buddha? Jayavarman VII himself, presented as a god king? Probably all 3. The lines blur in Khmer theology. The king is the Bodhisattva is the Buddha is the cosmos. It's a dizzying theological concept made concrete in stone. Walking through the Bayon is like being watched from every direction. Those serene faces follow you, their enigmatic smiles seeming to hold secrets. It's both comforting and unsettling, a manifestation of divine omniscience. Jayavarman VII's bas-reliefs at the Bayon are different from those at Angkor Wat. Where Suryavarman II depicted mythology and epic battles, Jayavarman VII showed daily life. There are scenes of market vendors selling goods, fishermen casting nets, women giving birth, circus performers entertaining crowds, even a detailed depiction of a naval battle with the Cham, complete with crocodiles attacking drowning soldiers. These carvings are invaluable historical records. They show us how ordinary Khmer people lived, what they wore, what they ate, how they worked and played. They humanize a civilization that can otherwise seem impossibly grand and distant, but Jayavarman VII's building program may have been too ambitious. The construction of so many temples, the maintenance of such a vast hydraulic infrastructure, the military campaigns to defend and expand the empire, all of it required enormous resources and labor. Some historians believe the empire overextended itself. The stone temples were religious centers, but they were also economic institutions. They owned land, collected taxes, employed thousands of priests, dancers, and servants. Inscriptions at Preah Khan record that the temple employed over 97,000 people, including dancers, musicians, and agricultural workers tending to the temple's lands. That's just one temple. Add to this the challenge of maintaining the hydraulic system. Modern archaeological research, using LiDAR and satellite imaging, has revealed just how complex Angkor's water management system was. Hundreds of miles of canals, dozens of reservoirs, elaborate distribution networks, all requiring constant maintenance and repair. Distribution networks, all requiring constant maintenance and repair. If the system was damaged by flooding, by warfare, by simple neglect, the consequences would cascade through the entire society. And there's evidence that the system did begin to fail in recent years. Climate scientists studying tree rings, sediment cores, and other paleoclimate data have discovered something startling. The 14th and 15th centuries saw dramatic climate disruptions in Southeast Asia. Periods of extreme monsoon flooding alternated with severe droughts. The very conditions that made Angkor's hydraulic system necessary also made it vulnerable. Too much water, and the canals overflowed, eroding embankments and damaging infrastructure. Too little water, and the system couldn't support the population. Evidence from Angkor suggests that by the late 14th century, the hydraulic system was breaking down. Canals silted up, reservoirs breached. The West Beret, which had functioned for centuries, may have begun to fail at the same time. The empire faced external pressures. The Thai kingdoms to the west, particularly Ayutthaya, were growing in power. In 1431, Ayutthayan forces attacked and sacked Angkor. While this date is traditionally given as the fall of Angkor, the reality was more complex. Angkor didn't fall in a single dramatic moment. It slowly faded. The kings moved their capital south to Phnom Penh, closer to maritime trade routes and away from the increasingly unmanageable hydraulic infrastructure. The temples weren't destroyed. They were simply abandoned, left to the jungle. Over the next 4 centuries, the jungle reclaimed Angkor. Tree roots grew through walls. Vines pulled down galleries. Monkeys nested in ancient libraries. The face towers of the Bayon stared out over a landscape that had returned to wilderness. But Angkor was never completely forgotten. Buddhist monks continued to maintain Angkor Wat, which remained an active pilgrimage site. The Khmer people still told stories of the ancient kings. And Western travelers, beginning in the 16th century, heard rumors of magnificent ruins hidden in the jungle. When Henri Mouhot discovered Angkor in 1860, he didn't really discover it. The local people had always known it was there. What he did was introduce it to the Western world, publishing descriptions and drawings that captured European imagination. In the 20th century, French colonial archaeologists began the work of excavation and restoration. After Cambodia's independence, that work continued, interrupted by the horrors of the Khmer Rouge period in the 1970s, when many scholars were killed and Angkor itself narrowly escaped destruction. Today, Angkor Wat appears on Cambodia's flag. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by millions of tourists annually. And it remains an active religious site, where Buddhist monks pray in the same galleries where Hindu priests performed rituals 1,000 years ago. What do we make of the Khmer Empire? What lessons can we draw from its rise and fall? Contemplative music begins. The Khmer achieved something extraordinary. They turned a marginal environment, a swampy floodplain with unpredictable rainfall, into the foundation of one of history's great civilizations. They built monuments that rival the pyramids of Egypt, the cathedrals of Europe, the temples of India. They created art of breathtaking beauty and technical sophistication.